As the relationship between Pakistan and China grows stronger, who is the most upset? The answer isn't India, Pakistan's direct rival, but rather its former patron, the United States. In the mid-20th century, long before the Sino-Pakistani partnership, the U.S. not only considered Pakistan its most important ally in South Asia, but, from Truman to Nixon, 5 successive presidents spared no expense in building it up as a counterweight to India. Yet, at a critical moment during the Second Indo-Pakistani War, the United States suddenly stabbed Pakistan in the back. This betrayal is the fundamental reason Pakistan would later turn to China. As I mentioned in the last episode of this series, from the very beginning of the India-Pakistan partition, the U.S. saw Pakistan as a key strategic foothold for expanding its influence in South Asia. And Pakistan, needing to stabilize itself in its early years, was willing to follow America's lead. When the Republican Dwight D. Eisenhower became president in 1953, he decided to significantly increase American investment in Pakistan to counter the growing Cold War threat. In October 1954, the U.S. presented Pakistani officials with an aid memorandum. In addition to continuing food support, the U.S. pledged to fully support the creation of an armed force capable of defending the country. The plan included aid for all 3 branches of the military. The Army would get help equipping 4 infantry divisions and 1.5 armored divisions. The Navy, starting from scratch, would be built around a core of 3 destroyers, and the Air Force would be supplied with 6 different types of aircraft. While the numbers in the initial memorandum weren't huge, for Pakistan, this was a chance to build a modern military from the ground up. They accepted the plan wholeheartedly and around the same time joined 2 U.S.-led alliances, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, SEATO, and the Central Treaty Organization, CENTO. But when news of this aid reached the Soviet Union, it responded by ramping up its own support for India. The U.S., seeing the Soviets raise the stakes in South Asia, felt compelled to up its own aid to Pakistan. Starting in 1955, American military assistance grew in both quantity and variety. By 1956, the initial budget of $170 million had been increased to a planned $790 million over 5 years. Even after the Democrats won the 1960 election, the Kennedy administration, facing an intensifying Cold War, continued to honor America's commitments. By 1965, Pakistan not only had 9 American-equipped divisions, but also an arsenal of advanced U.S. weaponry, including F-86, F-104, and B-57 aircraft. Feeling it now had the upper hand and facing increasing pressure from India in Kashmir, Pakistan decided the time was right for a preemptive war to reclaim lost territory.
But the Second Indo-Pakistani War did not go according to plan. In early 1965, Pakistan began recruiting and infiltrating militants into Indian-controlled Kashmir. India, though still smarting from its humiliating defeat to China in 1962, had seen its confidence boosted by continued Soviet aid. After repelling the Pakistani infiltrators, India, with its own ambitions in Kashmir, chose not to de-escalate. Instead, it sent in regular troops and expanded the war. As the side that had made the first move, Pakistan was prepared for India's response. At the end of August, it mobilized its forces, ready for a major showdown. But just as the 2 sides were on the brink of all-out war, an outside power intervened, but not in the way Pakistan had expected. Everyone knew that the Soviet Union was backing India. The only reason India had dared to escalate was because it had Moscow's support and tacit approval. By the same logic, since the U.S. had armed Pakistan and brought it into multiple alliances, it should have had Pakistan's back. But when India escalated, the U.S. not only failed to support Pakistan, but actively undermined it. The most critical blow came on September 8, 1965, when the U.S. announced a total arms embargo on both India and Pakistan. There were 3 reasons for this decision. First, while the U.S. saw Pakistan as an ally, many in Washington viewed its military government as a Soviet-style dictatorship. Second, because Pakistan had initiated the conflict by sending infiltrators, the U.S. considered it the aggressor and felt it had violated its promise not to upset the regional balance of power. Finally, in America's eyes, Pakistan was just a forward base for containing the Soviet Union, a tactical pawn, not a core ally. It wasn't worth the risk of a wider conflict. So, the U.S., thinking it was acting as an impartial referee, simply tried to shut the conflict down. But while the U.S. could cut off its own support, it couldn't stop the Soviets from supplying India. The arms embargo, in effect, cut off Pakistan's oxygen supply. Pakistan, which had started the war with a technological advantage, was suddenly in a desperate situation, with its ammunition dwindling with every shot. India, on the other hand, had a massive advantage in manpower. Just 2 weeks after the war began, hundreds of thousands of Indian troops crossed the border, heading straight for Lahore, Pakistan's second-largest city. For Pakistan's military government, the army's prestige was the foundation of its rule. It was tramped. If it kept fighting, it would surely lose, and the country might even break apart. But if it sued for peace, the humiliation would cause the government to collapse. With no good options, Pakistan had to grit its teeth and fight on. But then, an unexpected lifeline appeared. At almost the exact moment the U.S. announced its embargo, China publicly and unequivocally condemned India as the aggressor for sending its regular army across the border and demanded that it cease its military operations or bear all the
serious consequences. A week later, China began a series of military movements along the Sino-Indian border and demanded that India dismantle its military installations there. While China didn't directly intervene in the war, the message was clear. The military movements brought back painful memories for India of its crushing defeat in 1962. A large number of Indian troops that was supposed to be heading to the Western Front against Pakistan were instead kept in the north to guard against China. But China's intervention had an even bigger impact. Once China had publicly taken Pakistan's side, the Soviet Union could no longer sit back and watch India crush its new ally. A simple Indian victory was now in danger of escalating into a much larger conflict. And since China wasn't in the UN at the time, the Soviets had no way of knowing its true intentions. If the war escalated to China and Pakistan against India, and the Soviets didn't intervene, India would be crushed again. But if they did intervene, the US, which had been sitting on the sidelines, would be the ultimate winner. There was only one solution. The Soviets had to force India to the negotiating table. On September 20, 1965, just as Indian troops were closing in on Lahore, the UN Security Council passed a resolution demanding a ceasefire. 3 days later, a reluctant India and Pakistan began peace talks under Soviet mediation. In January 1966, they signed a peace treaty agreeing to withdraw to their pre-war positions. The news was met with outrage in India. They felt they had won the war, but had gained nothing. The Indian Prime Minister, who had signed the treaty, died suddenly of a heart attack the next day. And while Pakistan was also unhappy with the terms, the dominant feeling was the chilling realization that it had been abandoned by the United States. After the war, a chastened Pakistan began to rethink its alliances. While it didn't completely abandon its relationship with the US, it began to prioritize its ties with China. The Sino-Pakistani relationship warmed rapidly. But it would take another war for China to truly replace the United States as Pakistan's most important ally.